Our world is facing a refugee crisis. I was doing some research on this because I've heard that before, and I came across these statistics from the International Rescue Committee, and they highlight some of this need. Here's what they found. Currently, a record number of over 100 million people globally have been uprooted from their homes due to ongoing conflict and disaster. That's an increase of 20% compared to just a few years ago in 2020. And what's even more tragic is that the number of global refugees has doubled in the past 10 years. We are facing a crisis situation, not just we, but we globally. And refugees are people who have fled extreme dangers, whether to escape a relentless bombing, an invading army, gang violence, or other life-threatening circumstances. And we see the need in places like Ukraine. We've all seen that over the last year, and that's 5.4 million people have been displaced in the past year. Over 16% of the current global refugee population is Ukrainian. Or in countries like Syria, which remains the world's largest refugee and displacement crisis of our time. Over 25%, 1 in 4 of the total global refugee population is a direct result of the past 11 years of civil war in Syria. And here in the south end of Seattle, we get a clear picture of the impact of these many humanitarian crises, as we're the landing spot for those, and lots of times those seeking refuge in the United States. In fact, back in 2021, our home churches helped put together refugee welcome baskets with essential home supplies for those coming to the U.S. as a result of the refugee crisis in Afghanistan. And I share these real struggles in our world because they tie into our message today. And we're continuing in our series through the New Testament book of Matthew, which provides an account of Jesus' life and ministry. And so far, we've been exploring the early months of Jesus' life and the ways that his birth was a fulfillment of God's promise of a Messiah. And as we wrap up Matthew chapter 2 today, there's going to be sort of this stark shift in tone as the peace and the tranquility of our Christmas carols and nativity sets are shattered by the atrocities of someone desperate to cling to power. And if I could sum up the message today in a big idea, it would be this: God's plans will not be defeated by evil. God's plans will not be defeated by evil. I don't know if you've seen these, but there is a series of commercials tied to this tagline, "He Gets Us." And it's an ad campaign that presents different circumstances in Jesus' life and ministry in ways that connect to our current world, current matters that we face. And with the idea that in the complexities in our lives, in our world, that Jesus isn't absent or unaware. And one of the more recent videos from the He Gets Us campaign explores the idea of Jesus as a refugee. And I wanted to share this with you as it connects to the passage that we're going to be exploring today. Let's check out this commercial.
There was a mother and a father who had a son. They lived in a small village and didn't have much money, but they were happy. One day, they heard the head of their country was sending soldiers to their town because he thought they were part of an insurrection. The young family decided to flee. They grabbed only what they could carry and ran. They hiked for days, wondering if soldiers might still be following them. They were scared, hungry, and exhausted. But they were far away from the atrocities taking place in Bethlehem. That's all Mary and Joseph wanted: a safe place to call home.
That video paints ancient struggles in very real and vibrant colors. And what I appreciate is that it helps to create some of the urgency that faced Mary and Joseph, and how many today in places like Ukraine and Syria and Afghanistan, how they still face a similar urgency in equally difficult circumstances. And if you hear about these refugee crises and you say, man, I want to do something, I want to learn more, well, I want to point out a couple ways that you can learn more about the needs of refugees around the world, or even right here in our city. You see, there are some great nonprofits I would love to connect you with. And the first, as I've already mentioned, is International Rescue Committee. And I've got their website here on the screen if you want to write that down. And then there's also another one I would point you to is Lutheran Community Services. And as well, I've got their website here on the screen. And both of these have local offices and are doing great work right here in Seattle towards the worldwide refugee crisis. So let's jump into our passage and let's read more of this story. We'll pick up in Matthew chapter 2, verse 13. After the wise men were gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. Get up, flee to Egypt with the child and his mother. The angel said, stay there until I tell you to return, because Herod is going to search for the child to kill him. That night, Joseph left for Egypt with the child and Mary, his mother, and they stayed there until Herod's death. This fulfilled what the Lord had spoken through the prophet. I called my son out of Egypt. So to kind of retrace what we looked at in last week's message, when the wise men traveled to worship this new king of the Jews, whose star that they had seen in the night sky, their first stop was the palace in Jerusalem, because where else would you look, right? That's where you normally find kings. And the current king, an illegitimate king, King Herod, was surprised to learn this news. He didn't have any new sons that were potential heirs to his throne. So this was disturbing both to him and to all of Jerusalem, because they feared how Herod might respond. As a puppet king for the Romans, Herod was quick to squelch any and all perceived attempts at removing him from power. In fact, if you look at his Wikipedia page, he's got some things you wouldn't want to see. He had family members, believe it or not, wives and sons killed as a result of his paranoia. See, this was an evil and unstable man. And when the wise men came to honor the new king, Herod began to plot to have them go and find this king and then report back to him so that he could worship as well. But those weren't his intentions at all. And in verse 12, right before this section of the passage, we see God speak to these wise men in a dream and have them return home another way and avoid Herod altogether. And now in verse 13, we see not only did God come to the wise men in a dream, but also to Joseph. And what did this angel tell Joseph to do? It says, get up, right? Flee to Egypt. And I'm sure you've had vivid dreams just like I have, the ones where you're either, extremely happy or extremely sad to wake up from, depending on what the dream was about. But this dream was the kind of dream that, wakes you up immediately. And thankfully, this was not Joseph's first time hearing and obeying a message from God in a dream. Why is that important? Right? Because Herod is going to search for the child to kill him. He wasn't going to waste any time in eliminating any threat to his power. So that very night, Joseph, Mary, and Jesus rush off, likely with what they could quickly carry, which connects in many ways to the He Gets Us ad. And I thought this was a profound quote from theologian Scott McKnight. He said this, call it what you want, but the Holy Family's experience is one of flight, hiding, refuge, and seeking asylum in a foreign country where they could be surrounded by and welcomed by fellow Jews. And only after it was safe did they return, and even then they went to Nazareth to escape the eyes of the powerful. I don't know about you, but this all boggles my mind. Why would God's plan to enter creation be like this? When I think about how I would have acted, again, it's dangerous, right? If I were God, right, I would have chosen the palace, but God chose a stable. I would choose safety, but God chose instability. And my prayer is that would that bring comfort into the situations that you and I face? Right? We all would prefer that God would take us along the path of least resistance, but that isn't always His plan. Sometimes the route of our lives isn't around the storm, but it's right through it. And maybe that's what you're facing right now. And you're wondering where God is. Does He see you? Does He understand what you're going through? And I think of the wonderful promise in one of my favorite Psalms, Psalm 23, and the whole some of that psalm is right in the first line. The Lord is my shepherd. And it goes on to say that even when we walk through valleys where death and darkness seem ever present, what is that promise for us? He's with us. He's with us. Like the angel who came to Joseph, the Holy Spirit guides us in uncertainty. Like the gifts from the Magi, which served as miraculous provision for this unexpected circumstance, God still provides for you in miraculous ways. And as we see in Herod's attempt to end Jesus' life, though God entered onto the scene as a vulnerable, dependent baby, God's plan will not be defeated by evil. In fact, Matthew, in verse 15, he says, not only will God's plan overcome, but this unexpected escape to Egypt is a fulfillment of God's promise for a Messiah. Right? What is on one level a really terrible situation with no obvious good, right, is used by God for his ultimate purposes. And this fulfilled what the Lord spoke through the prophet, right? I called my son out of Egypt. Matthew here adds another string to his evidence wall, a quote from the Old Testament prophet Hosea. And we read this in Hosea 11, verse 1. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and I called him my son. I called my son out of Egypt. What we see here in Hosea is the prophet reminding the people of God, who at that time were scattered in exile, right, that they were God's covenant people. And just as he brought them out of Egypt before and into covenant relationship with him, he's going to do it again. And now in Jesus, God is again beginning something, a new people of God, which begins with a call out of Egypt, just like it was for their ancestors. Let's keep reading in Matthew and see how Herod attempted to thwart God's plan. We'll pick up in Matthew chapter 2, verse 16. Herod was furious when he realized that the wise men had outwitted him. He sent soldiers to kill all the boys in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old and under, based on the wise men's report of the star's first appearance. Herod's brutal action fulfilled what God had spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. This is in verse 18. A cry was heard in Ramah, weeping in great mourning. Rachel weeps for her children, refusing to be comforted, for they are dead. Joseph and Mary needed to flee for good reason, right? As a wicked man responded in ways that are atrocious. And Matthew here just kind of simply states the account of the death of all boys 2 years old and younger in Bethlehem. And no attempt is made to explain or justify this horror. And just to kind of give some scope to the lives lost in Herod's actions, since Bethlehem was a small village, the loss of life was likely between 10 and 20 boys. And in this atrocity, we are reminded of the lengths that evil will go to try and snuff out God's plan. Here again, we see Matthew adding another string to the evidence wall, pointing to a prophecy from the Old Testament book of Jeremiah, chapter 31, concerning another time of great mourning, as God's people were taken into exile. Around 597 BC, the Babylonians came and sacked Jerusalem, razing people's homes and destroying the entire city. And then they took all the people to Ramah, a place just north of Jerusalem. And at Ramah, the people were placed into caravans and scattered from one another. This was a scene of unimaginable anguish. And Rachel, in this picture, served as a representation of the mothers of Israel, weeping as their homes and their families were torn apart. And now we see here in Matthew 2, he's linking the site of that deportation to the site of this massacre, where in both cases, foreign forces attempt to wipe out God's plan for salvation through the chosen people of Israel and through the Messiah. See, God's plan will not be defeated by evil. And what we don't see in the text in Matthew, but would have been familiar to the first readers of this gospel account, is that Jeremiah 31 not only records the devastation of exile, but immediately in the next verses goes on to point to a hope and a future for God's people. In Jeremiah 31:16, it says this, "Do not weep any longer, for I will reward you." And then it goes on in the next verse, Jeremiah 31:17, it says, "So there is hope for your future." This is the God who we serve. He can bring joy in the midst of sadness, hope in the midst of despair. Now, let's finish reading Matthew chapter 2. We'll pick up in verse 19. When Herod died, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt. And he said, "Get up." The angel said, "Take the child and his mother back to the land of Israel, because those who were trying to kill the child are dead." So Joseph got up and returned to the land of Israel with Jesus and his mother. But when he learned that the new ruler of Judea was Herod's son, Archelaus, he was afraid to go there. And then, after being warned in a dream, he left for the region of Galilee. So the family went and lived in a town called Nazareth. And this fulfilled what the prophets had said: he will be called a Nazarene. So here is the first sign of God's promise in our big idea, right? Herod, who had attempted to take out God's promise of a Messiah, yet even though he tried, evil didn't have the final say, right? He died and God's plan moved forward. And we don't know how long the family stayed in Egypt, likely no more than a year or two. But when they discovered that Herod's son, Archelaus, was ruling over the region of Judea in his father's place, Joseph was warned in another dream not to return to Bethlehem. So the family took a detour to Nazareth in the region of Galilee, a region governed by Herod's, another one of his sons, Herod Antipas. In Nazareth, Joseph and Mary would raise Jesus away from the political reach of Jerusalem. And Matthew 2 ends with one final string of evidence for Jesus as God's Messiah. Okay, the move to Nazareth, Matthew tells us, fulfilled what the prophets, plural, said. And it was this: he will be called a Nazarene. And here's what's really interesting about this fulfillment is you can't find any prophet in the Old Testament that said that. So either Matthew is reading from a different set of scripture, or there's something else going on. And if you're wondering, it's definitely the second option. Okay, there's something going on here. And from what I could sort of gather, there are a couple different scenarios for what Matthew is referencing here at the end of chapter 2. And the first one really strikes near and dear to my dad's heart, okay? Matthew is possibly making a play on words. Like, this could be a pun. Like, how wonderful, right, is that? and the word for Nazareth is close to the Hebrew word Neser, or branch. And there's a quote from the Old Testament prophet Isaiah that many believe to be about the Messiah. And this is what it says in Isaiah 11, verse 1. It says, "Out of the stump of David's family will grow a shoot." Yes, a new branch, Neser, right? Bearing fruit from the old root. So out of the stump of David, meaning an ancestor from his kingly line, right, would grow from the tree that was cut off when Israel went into exile, when the kingdom was lost. And so what do we see Matthew highlighting, right? And so far in chapters 1 and 2, it's Jesus' life and ministry and how he is connected, right, through his adoptive father Joseph to David, right? See, in Jesus, Matthew sees God's promised kingly ancestor of David that would again shepherd the people of God, as we read in Matthew 1. A shoot or branch, Neser, right, the Nazarene. Yet there's another way that this could be understood, something that would have connected with prophets, plural, as Matthew points out in his reference. You see, Nazareth was not the kind of place you'd want to brag about being from. It was really small. It was far away. It was out kind of in the farm country, far from any sort of prominence. It was in Galilee, very rural. Also less Jewish, more Hellenistic, more Greek influenced. And I think of the words of Nathanael, who was one of Jesus' first disciples. And when he heard Nazareth mentioned as connected to Jesus, this was his answer. This is in the gospel account of John chapter 1, verses 45 and 46. Philip went to look for Nathanael and told him, "We have found the very person Moses and the prophets wrote about. His name is Jesus, the son of Joseph from where? Nazareth." Listen to Nathanael's response. "Nazareth? Can anything good come from Nazareth?" Right? Can anything good come from Nazareth? This was not the kind of place I guess you wanted to be from, but yet that is a place God chose. And as the prophets foretold, the Messiah would be despised. He would not have any defining features that would naturally draw us to him. And this infancy narrative has led up to this theme, right? This Messiah did not come with fanfare or glory, but was born in relative obscurity in Bethlehem. Then he and his family fled with powerless humility in the night to Egypt. And his arrival in history was surrounded with grief and sorrow when the Bethlehem infant boys were slaughtered. The child would not be raised, even in Bethlehem, which had tones of David and ties to him and his legacy, his lineage, but rather in the even more obscure town of Nazareth. And as we wrap up, I just wanted to share one more quote. It's this: the picture of Jesus in Matthew chapters 1 and 2 is an unfathomable equilibrium of human and divine elements. Jesus had a human lineage and a supernatural conception and birth. He is born into very human circumstances, but those circumstances are guided supernaturally. What a powerful reminder of the God we worship. When we look at Jesus' life and ministry, so much focus is rightly on his later years, right, of public ministry, his miracles and his teachings. Yet there is power also in what we see in the opening chapters. See, Jesus lived far from a normal life. He faced all the difficulty and unexpected circumstances where evil tried to overthrow God's plan. What we see, though, is not only was God's plan able to defeat evil, but in doing so, God was actually fulfilling his promise of a Messiah. Through the difficulty, God was working things out. And he still works in our situations today. If I could wrap up this message with a few next steps, the first would be this: become a follower of Jesus. The attempts of evil to try and overthrow God's plan of redemption remind us of the power in what Jesus came to do. If evil had that kind of response to his birth, what should be ours, right? At a minimum, we should look closely at who Jesus is. It's like that new restaurant that you pass that has like the line coming out the door. Like, that's something you should check out, right? There's something, it's like, wow, that must be something I need to look into. See, Jesus' life and death is a central point in history. Wise men saw a star in the sky. Illegitimate powers tried to end his life. This is something new that God is doing. And why was Jesus born? Why did he live and ultimately die on a cross? He did it to display God's heart for you and me. To announce that God's kingdom, like life in him, was now here. Jesus opened a door for us to be in God's family, and that's good news. If you long to receive the life Jesus came to proclaim and display, let someone in your home church know. And we'd love to pray for you and help you take next steps in what it means to follow Jesus. Another next step is this: is ask God for direction. In this story, we read about multiple dreams that God used to give direction. Have you ever experienced anything like that? Maybe you're thinking, man, I wish God would do something like that because I just really need to know what he's up to in my life. And the invitation we see throughout Scripture is that God invites us to go to him, to receive wisdom and direction from him. Especially when life is difficult. In crisis moments, we can come to him with everything we're facing. If you want to see examples of every emotion in seeking God's direction, the book of Psalms has it all. It has it in spades. But God invites us to come to him. He longs to speak to us if we will listen. When I was praying this week over these words that Jesus spoke later in Matthew's gospel, this is in Matthew chapter 7, verses 7 and 8. Jesus said, "Keep on asking, and you will receive what you ask for. Keep on seeking, and you will find. Keep on knocking, and the door will be opened for you. For everyone who asks receives. Everyone who seeks finds, and to everyone who knocks, the door will be opened." It's hard sometimes to believe this is possible. But Jesus invites you. He invites me to ask, to seek, to knock. He says that God will respond. So no matter what you face, know you can come to him for direction. And then the next step is this: trust his plan in difficult circumstances. This story in Matthew 2 is different than the Christmas story we typically highlight, right? Not all is calm and bright. There is also darkness and despair. Yet in the midst of extremely painful circumstances, God is present. And no matter how hard evil may try and overthrow God's plan, he is already won. Jesus has defeated sin, death, and the power of evil. There's nothing that can now separate us from the love of Jesus, as the Apostle Paul proclaims in Ephesians. So whatever you are facing, know that he is with you. He gets our pain, and we can trust his ultimate plan will have the final say. God bless Oasis.